What if everything you thought you knew about history was built on a foundation of lies? Not just small mistakes or oversights, but grand deceptions that have been repeated for so long they've become accepted as truth. Imagine living in a world where the stories we tell about our past, the tales of brave explorers, enlightened thinkers, and ancient civilizations, are actually carefully constructed myths designed to shape how we see ourselves and our place in the world. This isn't some conspiracy theory. This is the startling reality we're about to explore together. From the classroom to the courtroom, from scientific journals to popular culture, these 24 ancient lies have become modern truths, woven so deeply into the fabric of our understanding that we rarely stop to question them. Think about the last time you heard someone say that people in the Middle Ages thought the world was flat, or that Napoleon was unusually short, or that medieval Europeans never bathed. These aren't just harmless misconceptions, they're powerful narratives that influence how we view progress, intelligence, and even human capability itself. When we believe that our ancestors were primitive or superstitious, we create a false sense of superiority that prevents us from appreciating the complexity and sophistication of past cultures. When we accept distorted versions of historical events, we risk repeating the same patterns of manipulation and control that created those distortions in the first place. That's why uncovering these falsehoods matters more than ever. It's not just about correcting the record, but about reclaiming our ability to think critically about the information that shapes our world. In this video, we'll embark on an extraordinary journey through time and across continents, examining 24 of history's most persistent and influential lies. We'll discover how they originated, sometimes through honest error, but often through deliberate manipulation by those in power. We'll explore why they persisted for centuries, resistant to evidence and reason. Most importantly, we'll uncover the truths they've obscured and the realities they've distorted. By the time we reach the end of this exploration, you'll have gained not just new facts, but a new way of seeing, a perspective that questions assumptions, challenges narratives, and recognizes that history is always more complex, more fascinating, and more human than we've been led to believe. So prepare to have your understanding of the past and present fundamentally transformed as we dive into these captivating stories of deception, discovery, and the enduring power of truth. But how exactly do these deceptions take root so deeply that they outlive the civilizations that created them? The process is often surprisingly organic, beginning not with a grand conspiracy, but with a simple human need to make sense of a complex world. Imagine an ancient scholar observing the stars without a telescope, or a medieval cartographer mapping lands they'd never visited. They filled gaps in knowledge with the best information available, sometimes blending observation with mythology. These educated guesses, repeated over generations, gradually hardened into unquestioned facts. Then there's the powerful role of authority. When kings, religious leaders, or respected texts endorse a particular version of events, that narrative gains tremendous staying power. Challenging these accepted truths often meant challenging the entire social order, something few were willing to risk. We also can't overlook the appeal of a good story. Simplified, dramatic narratives often spread faster and stick longer than complex, nuanced realities. A tale about a mad emperor fiddling while his city burns is simply more memorable than the messy political and economic factors that might have actually caused a disaster. This combination of limited information, authoritative reinforcement, and storytelling appeal creates a perfect environment for historical falsehoods to flourish across centuries. Understanding this psychological and social machinery helps us see why these lies persist long after evidence contradicts them, and why unraveling them requires more than just presenting facts. It demands questioning the very foundations of what we think we know about the past. Now, let's dive into our first historical falsehood, the Flat Earth myth, a story that reveals just how easily a complete fabrication can become ingrained in our collective consciousness. It's commonly believed that ancient and medieval people thought the Earth was flat, and that this ignorance persisted until courageous explorers like Columbus proved them wrong. But the historical record tells a very different story. The truth is, the idea of a spherical Earth was well established in many ancient cultures. Greek philosophers like Pythagoras in the 6th century BCE and Aristotle a couple centuries later provided logical observations and mathematical proofs for a round Earth. They noticed that ships disappeared hull first over the horizon, and that the Earth cast a circular shadow on the Moon during lunar eclipses. By the 3rd century BCE, Eratosthenes not only knew the Earth was round, he calculated its circumference with remarkable accuracy using little more than sticks, shadows, and geometry. This knowledge wasn't lost during the Middle Ages either. Educated scholars throughout medieval Europe continued to teach and accept the Earth's roundness. So where did the flat Earth idea come from? It turns out this myth is almost entirely a product of the 19th century. Writers like Washington Irving, best known for stories like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, created a fictionalized account of Columbus's journey in which narrow-minded church officials opposed his voyage because they feared he would sail off the edge of a flat world. This never happened. In reality, Columbus's critics doubted his voyage because they thought he had underestimated the Earth's size, which he had, and would run out of supplies before reaching Asia. They were right about that. Columbus was wrong, and he only stumbled upon the Americas by pure luck. The flat Earth myth took hold because it served a purpose for later generations. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, as science and technology advanced rapidly, there was a tendency to portray the past as uniformly primitive and superstitious. This created a satisfying narrative of progress, where enlightened modern thinkers had overcome the ignorance of their ancestors. It was a story that flattered the present at the expense of the past, and it was repeated so often in textbooks, articles, and speeches that it became accepted as fact. This case shows us how historical inaccuracies can be invented to serve contemporary agendas, creating a distorted view of the past that says more about the time the myth was created than the time it claims to describe. Now, let's turn our attention to one of history's most enduring and evocative images, the depraved Emperor Nero, lounging in his palace while Rome burned, serenading the catastrophe with his fiddle. This powerful symbol of leaderly indifference has been cited for centuries as the ultimate example of decadence and negligence. But what if this entire scene is a fabrication, a piece of political propaganda so effective it has outlived the empire it was created in? The historical reality, pieced together from accounts closer to the event, paints a far more complex and surprising picture. For starters, the most damning detail is a complete anachronism. The violin or fiddle wouldn't be invented for another 1500 years. Nero was said to play the cithara, a type of lyre, an instrument that hardly conveys the same casual frivolity. More importantly, several Roman historians record that Nero wasn't even in Rome when the Great Fire broke out in 64 AD. He was at his villa in Antium, over 30 miles away. Upon hearing the news, he rushed back to the city and took immediate personal charge of the crisis response. He opened his own gardens to shelter the homeless, organized firefighting efforts, and arranged for food supplies to be brought in from the surrounding countryside to prevent mass starvation. These are not the actions of a man who is indifferent to his people's suffering. So how did this myth become so entrenched? The answer lies in the brutal world of Roman politics. Nero had powerful enemies, particularly in the Senate and among the old aristocratic families, who despised his populist tendencies and his passion for Greek arts and culture, which they considered beneath the dignity of a Roman emperor. In the fire's aftermath, as the city smoldered and rumors swirled, these opponents saw a prime opportunity to destroy his reputation. They began spreading the story that Nero had set the fire himself to clear land for a new, grandiose palace complex, the Domus Aurea, and that he had celebrated the destruction by performing a poem about the fall of Troy. This narrative was a masterstroke of character assassination, playing on existing fears and prejudices. It was perpetuated by historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, who, while writing decades later, relied on sources from these very aristocratic circles hostile to Nero. The image of the mad artist emperor, so detached from reality that he would revel in the destruction of his own capital, was simply too symbolically potent to fade away. It served as a perfect cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power and misplaced priorities, ensuring its place in the historical imagination for millennia. This case is a stark reminder that what we often accept as a vivid historical anecdote is frequently a weapon from an ancient political battle, its original context lost to time, leaving only a compelling but deeply misleading story in its wake. But perhaps no historical lie has cast a longer, more pervasive shadow than the idea of the so-called Dark Ages, a 1,000-year gap of ignorance and stagnation wedged between the brilliance of Rome and the awakening of the Renaissance. This label itself paints a powerful picture, a world plunged into darkness where learning died, art vanished, and humanity simply waited for the light to return. It's a compelling narrative, but it's one that crumbles under the slightest scrutiny. The truth is, the period following Rome's decline was not a monolithic era of backwardness, but a complex tapestry of challenge, adaptation, and quiet, profound innovation. While it's true that Western Europe faced immense difficulties, political fragmentation, economic disruption, and the loss of large-scale infrastructure, to define an entire millennium solely by its struggles is a profound historical injustice. The very concept of the Dark Ages is a later invention, a piece of brilliant, if dishonest, self-promotion by Renaissance thinkers like Petrarch. In their fervor to celebrate their own rebirth of classical learning, they deliberately framed the preceding centuries as a barren wasteland, a dark void against which their own brilliance could shine all the brighter. They needed a foil for their new era, and so they created one by erasing the achievements of their immediate predecessors. This false narrative completely ignores the dazzling intellectual and cultural flourishing happening elsewhere while parts of Europe were reorganizing. The Byzantine Empire in the East stood as a direct continuation of Rome, preserving a vast treasury of classical knowledge, law, and art within the walls of Constantinople for over a millennium. Its universities and libraries were centers of learning that never went dark. Even more significantly, the Islamic Golden Age, stretching from Baghdad to Cordoba, became the undeniable epicenter of global advancement. While Charlemagne was struggling to write his name, scholars in the House of Wisdom in Baghdad were not just preserving Greek texts by Aristotle and Plato. They were actively debating, refining, and expanding upon them. They made staggering original contributions: algebra from Al-Khwarizmi, groundbreaking optics from Ibn al-Haytham, and sophisticated medical encyclopedias from physicians like Avicenna that would remain standard texts in European universities for centuries. To claim this period was one of intellectual stagnation is to willfully ignore the very heart of where human knowledge was being pushed to its limits. Even within Europe itself, the story is far from one of simple decay. This was the era that gave us the breathtaking architectural ingenuity of Gothic cathedrals, their soaring vaults and flying buttresses solving engineering problems the Romans never could. It was a time of crucial agricultural revolution with the development of the heavy plow and the three-field crop rotation system, which dramatically increased food production and supported growing populations. Monastic communities, often portrayed as isolated and introspective, became vital nodes of scholarship where monks meticulously copied not only religious texts but also works of philosophy, history, and science, ensuring their survival for future generations. The foundation of the first universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford during the High Middle Ages created structured institutions for higher learning that continue to shape education today. The Dark Ages were, in reality, a period of incubation, a necessary and dynamic time of rebuilding, rethinking, and laying the groundwork for the world that was to come. Dismissing it as a dark gap misses the continuous thread of human ingenuity and resilience. It prevents us from seeing how history truly progresses, not in sudden, brilliant explosions of light, but through a constant, often messy, process of adaptation, preservation, and slow, steady innovation that connects every age to the next. Now, let's tackle one of the most visually persistent myths in all of history: the image of the Viking warrior, axe in one hand, shield in the other, and atop his head, a gleaming helmet crowned with a pair of formidable horns. This icon is everywhere, from football team logos to blockbuster films, a symbol of raw, primal power. But here's the astonishing truth: there is not a single piece of archaeological evidence, not one excavated helmet from the entire Viking age that actually looks like this. The reality of Viking head protection was far more practical and intelligent. The few complete helmets that have been found, like the spectacular German Boo helmet in Norway, are simple, rounded caps of iron with a protective guard for the nose and sometimes a chainmail curtain to protect the neck. They were designed for survival in the brutal chaos of a shield wall, where agility, vision, and the ability to deflect blows were matters of life and death. A pair of large horns or wings would have been a catastrophic liability, a perfect handle for an opponent to grab to wrench your head back, exposing your throat, or an awkward protrusion that could catch a weapon swing and drive it right into your skull. The Vikings were masterful, pragmatic warriors and smiths. They would never have designed something so obviously suicidal. So how did this fictional headgear become so inextricably linked with these Norse explorers? The myth wasn't born on the bloody fields of England or the fjords of Scandinavia, but in the imaginative theaters of 19th century Europe. The key figure in this fabrication was costume designer Carl Emil Doppler, who created the outfits for an 1876 production of Richard Wagner's epic opera cycle, Der Ring des Nibelungen. Wagner's works were grandiose mythological dramas drawing on Norse and Germanic legends, and Doppler wanted the gods and heroes to look visually striking and primal on stage. He added horns to the helmets, likely inspired by descriptions of ancient Germanic priests or by prehistoric Nordic bronze artifacts that were actually ceremonial and not from the Viking era at all. The effect was instantaneous and powerful. The image was so dramatic, so perfectly encapsulating a romantic ideal of barbaric splendor, that it was quickly adopted by other artists, illustrators, and eventually advertisers. It spoke to a romantic nationalist movement that wanted a heroic, visually distinct past, and the horned helmet fit the bill perfectly, even if it was pure invention. This case is a perfect example of how art doesn't just imitate life, it can sometimes completely overwrite it, creating a cultural symbol so potent that it becomes more real than the historical truth it replaced. It reminds us that what we know about the past is often a patchwork of fact and fiction, stitched together by the storytellers of later eras to serve their own aesthetic and cultural needs. This idea that kings and queens inherently rule because God wants them to is one of those historical concepts that feels ancient and universal, as if it's the default setting for human governance since the beginning of time. We picture a medieval monarch hand placed on a Bible, their authority unquestionable because it was supposedly handed down directly from the heavens. But this image is largely a mirage, a specific political doctrine that was crafted at a very particular moment in European history and then conveniently projected backward to make it seem eternal. The reality of how societies have justified power is far more diverse, pragmatic, and fascinating. In ancient Egypt, the pharaoh was indeed considered a living god, a direct fusion of political and divine authority. However, this was the exception, not the rule. For every Egypt, there were societies like the Roman Republic, where power was theoretically vested in the Senate and the people long before it was ever concentrated in an emperor. Even after the rise of the emperors, their legitimacy often stemmed from a delicate balance of military support, senatorial approval, and public works, not solely from a claim of divine right. The title they cherished was princeps or first citizen, a nod to the lingering ideals of the Republic. Look further east to China, and you find the mandate of heaven, a concept that sounds similar but operates in a radically different way. Yes, the emperor was the son of heaven, but this mandate was conditional. If a ruler was unjust, incompetent, or if disasters plagued the land, it was a clear sign that heaven had withdrawn its favor, justifying rebellion and the installation of a new, more virtuous dynasty. This was a theory of power that included a built-in right of revolution, a far cry from the European notion of a king's God-given, unassailable right to rule. So where did this potent idea of an absolute divine right come from? Its most famous and forceful expression emerged in the 16th and 17th centuries, a period of tremendous religious and political upheaval in Europe. As the authority of the Catholic Church fractured after the Reformation, monarchs sought new ways to consolidate their power and assert control over their own national churches. Thinkers like King James I of England articulated the doctrine with fierce clarity, arguing that kings were appointed by God and accountable to no earthly power, not to the Pope, not to Parliament, and certainly not to their subjects. This was a powerful tool to squash dissent and centralize authority. It was a top-down political theory designed for a specific crisis, not an ancient truth finally discovered. The problem is that later historians, looking back through the lens of this early modern absolutism, began to see its shadow everywhere. They assumed that because a king in the year 1600 claimed to rule by divine right, a king in the year 800 must have believed the exact same thing. This is a classic historical error known as presentism, imposing contemporary ideas onto the past. In doing so, they erased a rich tapestry of other ways power was negotiated. In medieval Europe, for instance, the relationship between a king and his nobles was often a complex feudal contract, a web of mutual obligations and privileges. A king who overstepped could face serious consequences, from open rebellion to the forced signing of a charter like Magna Carta, which explicitly placed the monarch under the law. The divine right of kings wasn't an ancient universal belief. It was a clever and forceful innovation, a political weapon that rewrote history to serve the needs of the present, obscuring the messy, contested, and wonderfully diverse ways humans have always organized and questioned power. Picture a scene across Europe as the year 1000 approaches. Masses of people huddled in terror, abandoning their fields and homes, desperately praying for salvation as they await the fiery end of the world promised in the Book of Revelation. It's a dramatic image that has been popularized in everything from classic literature to modern documentaries, but it's almost entirely a fiction. The reality of the turn of the first millennium was far less cinematic and much more human. For the vast majority of people living at that time, the pressing concerns were not cosmic prophecies but the immediate challenges of harvests, local disputes, and the basic struggle for survival. The idea of a continent-wide panic is a story we've projected backward, a myth that reveals more about our own fascination with apocalypse than it does about the medieval mind. One of the most straightforward reasons this fear didn't take hold is surprisingly simple: calendar confusion. The Gregorian calendar we use today wasn't adopted until the 16th century, and in the year 1000, Europe used a variety of dating systems. Many regions marked time based on the reign of their local king or lord, while the scholarly use of the Anno Domini system, which counts years from the birth of Christ, was still not universally standardized or even widely known among the peasantry. For a farmer in France or England, the year was more likely identified by a notable local event: a harsh winter, the birth of an heir to the count, or a particularly good harvest, than by an abstract number counting down to 1000. The concept of a precise, universally recognized millennial milestone simply didn't exist for them in the way we imagine it. Their sense of time was cyclical, tied to seasons and religious feast days, not a linear countdown to a prophesied end point. When we do scour the historical records from the decades surrounding the year 1000, the evidence for widespread terror is conspicuously absent. Chronicles from monasteries, which were the centers of learning and record-keeping, show no surge in apocalyptic writings. Instead, they document the usual affairs: land grants, the construction of new churches, political squabbles, and accounts of weather and crops. If clerics and monks, the most literate and theologically aware people of the era, weren't consumed by millennial panic, it's highly unlikely the general population was. In fact, this period saw a remarkable surge of energy and optimism now known to historians as the terrible year 1000 school of thought, which argues the opposite, that the era was one of renewed religious fervor, economic expansion, and architectural innovation, exemplified by the dawn of Romanesque architecture and the beginning of what would become the crusading movement century later. So how did this potent myth of a panic-stricken medieval world arise? Its origins lie not in the 10th century but in the 19th. Romantic historians of the Enlightenment and later eras, eager to draw a sharp contrast between their own enlightened age and a superstitious past, latched onto a few isolated accounts of preachers mentioning the end times and amplified them into a continent-wide phenomenon. Writers like Jules Michelet in France popularized the idea of the year 1000 as a moment of collective insanity, a story that fit perfectly with a modern narrative of progress that viewed the Middle Ages as a dark period of irrational fear waiting to be dispelled by reason and science. This was a classic case of presentism interpreting the past through the lens of contemporary values and anxieties. We, in our modern world, are often preoccupied with apocalyptic scenarios, from nuclear annihilation to climate change to the Y2K computer bug, and we unconsciously assume that people in the past must have shared similar fears about their own symbolic dates. This projection prevents us from seeing the medieval world on its own terms, as a place where people were just as pragmatic, complex, and focused on their daily lives as we are, capable of distinguishing between powerful religious stories and the tangible realities of their existence. Recognizing this allows us to move beyond caricature and appreciate the resilience and normality of our ancestors, who were far too busy living their lives to stop and wait for the end of the world. Now, let's dismantle one of the most pervasive and politically charged historical falsehoods: the idea that the ancient Greeks and Romans were a monolithic, fair-skinned people who would fit neatly into modern racial categories. This assumption, deeply embedded in popular culture from Hollywood films to textbook illustrations, fundamentally misrepresents the vibrant, interconnected reality of the ancient Mediterranean world. The truth is, the empires of Greece and Rome were sprawling, multi-ethnic networks of trade, conquest, and migration, where a vast spectrum of physical appearances was not just common but entirely ordinary. To imagine the Forum in Rome or the Agora in Athens as homogeneous spaces is to overlook the very essence of these civilizations. They were hubs of a known world that stretched from the misty highlands of Scotland to the sun-baked banks of the Nile, and from the Iberian Peninsula to the Mesopotamian frontier. A Roman citizen could be an olive-skinned legionary from Syria, a dark-complexioned merchant from Carthage, or a fair-haired trader from Gaul. The ancient world simply did not conceptualize race in the rigid, skin-deep hierarchy that emerged much later in history. Their prejudices were far more likely to be based on language, customs, and whether you were a citizen or a barbarian living beyond the empire's limits. This myth didn't emerge from the ancient world itself, but was carefully constructed centuries later. Its most potent architects were the scholars and artists of the European Renaissance and later the Enlightenment. As nations like Britain, France, and Germany began to forge their own national identities, they desperately sought a glorious pedigree to legitimize their power and cultural ascendancy. They looked back to Greece and Rome as the foundational pillars of Western civilization, and in an act of profound historical appropriation, decided that this illustrious heritage must belong exclusively to them. This required a deliberate whitening of history, an erasure of its true diversity. This process accelerated dramatically during the 18th and 19th centuries with the rise of scientific racism and the brutal realities of colonial expansion. To justify the enslavement of African peoples and the subjugation of other cultures, European powers propagated the idea that the pinnacle of human achievement, the classical world, was the product of a singular, white race. This fabricated lineage was used to argue that they alone were the rightful heirs to this greatness, and that other cultures were inherently inferior. Museums filled with looted artifacts, neoclassical architecture in government buildings, and educational systems that taught the classics as the exclusive birthright of Europe all reinforced this powerful and exclusionary narrative. The consequences of this lie are not merely academic, they are deeply felt even today. It has shaped everything from immigration policies and notions of national belonging to the very composition of university classics departments. For centuries, it created a barrier telling people of color that the grand narratives of philosophy, democracy, and law were not their history to claim or celebrate. It is only through recent scholarship and a more honest look at the evidence that we are beginning to correct the record. We now understand that several Roman emperors, like Septimius Severus, were born in North Africa. We read the poetry of Pushkin, who was of African descent, and see the frescoes from Pompeii depicting the everyday lives of people with a wide range of skin tones. Acknowledging this complex, colorful tapestry doesn't diminish the classical world. It enriches it, revealing a far more interesting and relatable story of human interaction and exchange. It allows us to see these ancient cultures not as isolated, pristine monuments to a single ethnicity, but as what they truly were: dynamic, messy, cosmopolitan melting pots whose legacy belongs to all of humanity, not just a select few. Of all the symbols for knowledge lost to the ravages of time, few are as potent or as heartbreaking as the great Library of Alexandria. We are told a singular, tragic tale, a vast repository of the ancient world's wisdom, containing hundreds of thousands of irreplaceable scrolls, was consumed in a single, catastrophic inferno. This story often casts a specific villain, sometimes Julius Caesar, accidentally setting the docks ablaze during a civil war, other times zealous religious mobs centuries later intent on purging pagan thought. It's a powerful narrative of a dark age descending, of a switch being flipped from light to darkness in one fateful night. But this dramatic story, while emotionally resonant, is a profound oversimplification. The truth of the library's demise is not a sudden murder but a long, slow death by 1,000 cuts, a far more complex and revealing story about how civilizations truly rise and fall. The idea of one fire delivering the killing blow is archaeologically and historically untenable. The library was not a standalone building but part of a larger research institution called the Mauseon, or Temple of the Muses. It was a living, breathing center of scholarship that depended entirely on the patronage of the ruling Ptolemaic dynasty. Its decline began not with flames, but with a withdrawal of this royal support. As the Ptolemies' power waned through internal family squabbles and increasing pressure from Rome, funding for the expensive work of acquiring new scrolls, copying them, and housing scholars inevitably dried up. A library that isn't growing is already beginning to die. Furthermore, Alexandria itself was a tinderbox of political violence for centuries. It witnessed numerous brutal street battles, riots, and military sieges. During one such conflict in 48 BC, Julius Caesar did indeed set fire to ships in the harbor, and that fire may have spread to warehouses where some scrolls were stored. But this was likely a secondary repository, not the main library itself. Centuries later, the city faced purges under Christian emperors targeting pagan sites, and still later, conquest by Muslim armies. Each of these events could have involved the destruction of books, but they were separate incidents scattered across hundreds of years. The library didn't fall in a day. It was chipped away at decade after decade, its collections scattered, sold, or left to rot through neglect long before the last shelf was cleared. So why does the myth of the single, devastating fire persist with such stubborn force? It speaks to a deep psychological need within us. A slow decline due to bureaucratic neglect and fading interest is messy, complicated, and frankly, unsatisfying. It lacks a clear villain and a definable moment of tragedy. A dramatic fire, however, provides a clean, morally clear story. It gives us a palpable sense of loss and an easy target for our outrage, whether it's a reckless general or an intolerant mob. This simplified version transforms the library from a real institution into a perfect symbol, a cautionary tale about the fragility of knowledge and the dangers of ideological extremism. We use its story to warn ourselves about the perils of burning books, making it a powerful rhetorical tool in debates about censorship and intellectual freedom. The myth, in a way, has become more useful than the truth, but in clinging to this simpler story, we ironically do a disservice to the real library and its actual lessons. The true tragedy of Alexandria wasn't just the loss of specific texts. It was the collapse of an entire ecosystem dedicated to knowledge. The library's greatness came from its proactive and aggressive program of acquisition. It sought out books from every known culture, had them translated, and constantly renewed and refreshed its collections. Its decline teaches us that preserving knowledge isn't a one-time event but a continuous, active process that requires constant investment, cultural priority, and political stability. It's a lesson that resonates deeply today as we grapple with how to preserve our own digital heritage against the slow, creeping threats of format obsolescence, corporate neglect and link rot. The fall of the Library of Alexandria wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a long, slow fade, reminding us that the greatest threat to knowledge is often not a violent outburst, but simple, quiet indifference. Now, let's tackle one of history's most enduring and oddly personal myths, the idea that Napoleon Bonaparte was a tiny, temperamental man whose towering ambition was a form of compensation for his lack of height. This image of the short emperor has become a cultural shorthand, a psychological archetype used to explain everything from aggressive drive to political insecurity. But the actual facts tell a very different story. Napoleon stood approximately 5 feet 6 inches tall by the French measurement system of his day, which translates to about 5 feet 7 inches in modern British and American units. This was not unusually short for a Frenchman in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. In fact, it was perfectly average, perhaps even slightly above the mean for his era. So how did a man of completely ordinary stature become the global poster child for short man syndrome? The answer lies not in French measuring tapes, but in British cartoon shops and a clever, enduring propaganda campaign. The primary architects of Napoleon's diminished stature were his enemies across the English Channel. As Napoleon's armies marched across Europe, threatening British interests and dominance, conventional military defeats were hard to come by. So Britain waged a war of words and images, and one of its most effective weapons was ridicule. British newspapers and, most memorably, satirical cartoonists like James Gilray relentlessly portrayed Napoleon as a childishly small, petulant, and unstable figure. They dubbed him Little Boney, depicting him in prints as a tiny, rage-filled toddler throwing tantrums next to his giant grenadier guards, or as a comically small general being manipulated like a puppet by his much taller advisors. The goal was to cut the feared emperor down to size, to transform him in the public mind from a brilliant military strategist into a laughable, insignificant upstart. This caricature was incredibly effective, providing a comforting narrative for a British public anxious about the threat he posed. It's far easier to face an enemy you've been taught to laugh at than one you've been taught to fear. This deliberate mockery was then supercharged by a simple, almost comical error, a unit conversion mistake. When Napoleon's height was recorded by his French doctor, it was given as 5 feet 2 inches in French pides. However, a French pide was longer than a British foot. 5 feet 2 in French units equated to the 5 feet 6 or 7 we understand today. But British propagandists either intentionally ignored this difference or genuinely misunderstood it, reporting his height as a mere 5 feet 2 in British feet, making him seem significantly shorter than he actually was. This numerical error gave the caricature a false sense of factual legitimacy, cementing the myth in the public consciousness for generations. It's a perfect storm of historical misinformation, a potent propaganda narrative fused with a seemingly credible but utterly wrong data point. The persistence of this lie reveals something profound about how we conflate physical presence with leadership capability. The image of the short, overcompensating dictator has become a powerful stereotype, one that influences how we assess leaders even today. We unconsciously associate height with authority, strength, and command, a bias that modern studies have shown still exists in everything from presidential elections to corporate hiring. The Napoleon myth feeds directly into this prejudice, providing a seemingly historical precedent for a deeply ingrained cultural idea. It allows us to reduce a complex, brilliant, and flawed historical figure to a simple psychological trope, ignoring the vast geopolitical forces, economic policies, and military innovations that defined his era. We remember Napoleon's supposed shortness because it fits a neat story. while we forget the details of his civil code or his reform of the French education system because they are complex and don't fit a simple caricature. His legacy is a stark reminder that how we choose to remember a person is often less about who they were and more about what we need them to represent. This sweeping generalization that women in the ancient world were universally confined, silenced, and powerless is a historical caricature that collapses under the weight of its own simplicity. While it is undeniable that patriarchal structures were the norm and that gender inequality existed in forms both subtle and severe, to paint every ancient society with the same broad brush of oppression is to ignore a rich and complex tapestry of female agency, authority, and influence. The reality is far more fascinating and varied, revealing a world where women could not only navigate the constraints of their time but could, in specific contexts, transcend them entirely to become some of the most powerful figures in history. Consider the sun-baked banks of the Nile, where a woman didn't just participate in power, she literally embodied it. Hatshepsut, one of ancient Egypt's most successful pharaohs, initially ruled as regent for her young stepson, but soon took the unprecedented step of declaring herself the full pharaoh, His Majesty Hatshepsut. In statues and reliefs, she is depicted with the traditional false beard and muscular physique of a male king, a brilliant piece of political theater that leveraged the existing language of power to cement her divine right to rule. Under her two-decade reign, Egypt experienced an era of unprecedented peace, prosperity, and magnificent architectural achievement, including her magnificent mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari. She was not an isolated anomaly. She was part of a system where royal women held immense religious and economic power as God's wives of Ammon, controlling vast estates and serving as crucial political players. To claim ancient Egyptian women were universally oppressed is to ignore the woman who sat at the very apex of its power structure and built a legacy that would endure for millennia. Far from the Egyptian deserts, in the bustling, marble-clad heart of the Roman Empire, we find a different kind of female power not on the throne, but in the marketplace and the home. Roman law, under the system of guardianship, did place certain legal limitations on women, but it also granted them significant economic rights that would be enviable in many later periods. A Roman woman could own property, inherit vast fortunes, run businesses, and manage her own finances. We have surviving legal documents, letters, and inscriptions that testify to women like the formidable Terentia, wife of Cicero, who managed complex financial assets and provided her husband with crucial political counsel and loans. In the town of Pompeii, a bakery was found with the name of its owner, a woman named Asalina, still painted on the wall, and graffiti from the city reveals women involved in trades from lamp making to prostitution, exercising economic agency in a very public way. While they were excluded from the formal political offices of the Senate, they wielded immense influence behind the scenes through family connections, patronage, and their control of household wealth. Their power was real, even if it was often exercised in the corridors of a domus rather than the halls of the Senate. This myth of universal female powerlessness is not an ancient one. It is a modern fabrication, a projection of later biases onto the past. The historians of the 18th and 19th centuries, who were largely men writing within deeply patriarchal societies, often interpreted the past through the lens of their own values. They saw the absence of women from their narrow definition of history, the chronicle of kings, wars, and politics, and assumed there was nothing else to see. They either overlooked or actively downplayed evidence of female authority because it did not fit their world view or their need to portray their own era as the pinnacle of civilization. In some cases, this distorted history was used to justify contemporary gender norms, suggesting that the subordination of women was a timeless, natural state of affairs rather than a specific cultural arrangement. This created a self-reinforcing loop. The past was interpreted to justify the present, and that justification then made the misinterpretation of the past seem even more true. Uncovering these complexities does more than just correct the historical record. It fundamentally challenges our assumptions about what is traditional. It reveals that the roles and capabilities of women have never been a monolith. In the Celtic world, classical authors wrote with astonishment about warrior queens like Boudica, who led entire nations into battle. In the Mesopotamian city-state of Ur, we have records of women like the merchant and priestess Ena Macron letter 1, E63IR, who was deeply involved in the copper trade. By acknowledging this diversity of experience, we break free from a simplistic, progress-oriented narrative that views history as a straight line from oppression to liberation. Instead, we see a far more interesting story of fluctuation, negotiation, and unexpected pockets of power. This nuanced understanding is crucial, for it allows us to appreciate the full spectrum of human history in all its complicated, contradictory, and often surprising glory. Of all the chilling images we associate with the so-called barbarism of the Middle Ages, few are as viscerally terrifying as the Iron Maiden. We can all picture it, a standing, coffin-shaped cabinet, its hinged front swung open to reveal a ghastly interior lined with long, cruel spikes. The victim is sealed inside, and those spikes slowly pierce their body in a dozen places, delivering an excruciating, prolonged death. It's the centerpiece of every haunted dungeon exhibit and a staple of horror films, the ultimate symbol of medieval cruelty and a dark age of unimaginable suffering. But here is the astonishing and undeniable truth. The Iron Maiden, as we know it, is a complete fabrication. There is not a single piece of credible evidence, no court records, no inventories, no contemporary accounts, and certainly no surviving artifacts, that such a device was ever used in the medieval period. This quintessential icon of torture is nothing more than a grotesque fairy tale, a morbid fantasy born centuries after the era it claims to represent. So where did this monstrous idea come from? The trail leads not to a medieval dungeon but to an 18th century university library. The first known written description appears in 1793, when a German philosophy professor named Johann Philipp Siebenkees wrote about an alleged execution in Nuremberg in 1515. He claimed a criminal was placed inside a spiked coffin as punishment for his crimes. However, Siebenkees provided no verifiable source for this story, and historians now widely believe he either fabricated it entirely or was repeating a local legend. This single, unsubstantiated account then took on a life of its own. Over a century later, in 1802, a man named Matthew Peacock wrote a highly sensationalized account of finding an Iron Maiden in a castle ruin, a story now considered a clear hoax. The most famous Iron Maiden, the one displayed in Nuremberg and later destroyed in the bombing of World War II, was itself a composite creation, likely cobbled together in the 19th century from old pieces of wood and metal, and passed off as a genuine antique to satisfy the macabre curiosity of the public. The device was a prop, not a relic, a physical manifestation of a story that had already been circulating for 100 years. The real origins of the concept are likely far older and more literary than historical. The idea of a spiked container used for torture appears in ancient texts, but not in a European context. The Greek historian Polybius, writing in the 2nd century BC, described how the Spartan tyrant Nabis used a mechanical statue of his wife, Apega, which would embrace his enemies and pierce them with hidden spikes. This ancient tale, passed down through scholarly works, may have been the seed that, centuries later, germinated into the legend of the Iron Maiden. It was a case of historical Chinese whispers, where a story from one culture and time was misremembered, relocated, and dramatically embellished until it became something entirely new and seemingly rooted in medieval Europe. The persistence and power of this myth reveal a deep psychological need to paint the past as a canvas of unenlightened brutality. By creating and believing in monsters like the Iron Maiden, we reinforce a comforting narrative of progress. We can look back at those dark dungeons and shudder, secure in the belief that our own era is more civilized, more humane, and more advanced. It allows us to distance ourselves from the complexities and cruelties of our own time by projecting all that darkness onto a conveniently simplified and savage past. This is not to say the Middle Ages lacked torture. They certainly had horrific methods, but their tools were often cruder, more straightforward implements like the rack, the thumbscrew, or the executioner's axe. The Iron Maiden, with its theatrical, almost mechanical precision, feels like a perverse work of art, a device designed more for spectacle than for pragmatic interrogation or punishment. It caters to a Victorian fascination with Gothic horror and a modern obsession with engineered, cinematic suffering. We invented the Iron Maiden not because it existed, but because we needed it to exist to serve as a perfect, horrifying benchmark against which we could measure our own supposed virtue. It is a dark mirror reflecting our own fascination with cruelty, a fiction we created to convince ourselves that such darkness is always someone else's history, never our own. This widespread belief that everyone in the ancient world died in their 20s or 30s is one of those historical shortcuts that feels intuitively true but completely falls apart under scrutiny. We picture a bleak existence where turning 40 was a monumental achievement and anyone with gray hair was a rare and venerated elder. This gloomy picture, however, is a classic case of a statistical misunderstanding that has profoundly warped our view of our ancestors' lives. The key to unraveling this myth lies in a simple but crucial distinction: the difference between average life expectancy and actual lifespan. When we see that the average life expectancy in ancient Rome was maybe 25 years, our modern minds immediately jump to the conclusion that 25 was a typical age of death. But that number is dramatically pulled down by a heartbreakingly high rate of infant and childhood mortality. Diseases that we now vaccinate against or easily treat with antibiotics, like measles, smallpox, or even a simple infected cut, were often fatal for the very young. Archaeological evidence from Roman cemeteries shows that in some places, nearly a third of all children died before their 10th birthday. This tragic reality skews the average beyond recognition. If you were one of the lucky ones who survived the perilous journey of childhood, your chances of living a long life were actually quite good. Once a person made it to their 15th birthday, the statistics tell a very different story. A Roman man who reached adulthood could reasonably expect to live into his late 40s or 50s, and many went far beyond that. We have countless examples from tombstones, legal documents, and historical accounts that attest to this. The famous orator Cicero was in his 60s when he was executed, and his writings are filled with references to his peers living similarly long lives. The Emperor Augustus died at 76, and his wife Livia reached 86. This wasn't just true for the pampered elite, either. Examination of skeletal remains from ordinary Roman towns and military cemeteries reveals a significant number of individuals who lived well into their 60s and 70s, their bones showing the classic signs of aging like arthritis and tooth wear. A soldier who survived his 25 years of service would often retire to a farm and live for another 2 or 3 decades. This pattern holds true across many ancient cultures. In classical Greece, the playwright Sophocles wrote some of his greatest tragedies in his 80s. This evidence paints a picture not of a world where everyone dropped dead young, but one where if you could get through the first difficult decade, you had a solid chance of experiencing what we would still consider a full and lengthy life. The persistence of this myth says more about us than it does about the past. It reinforces a comforting, if condescending, narrative of progress. By imagining our ancestors as constantly teetering on the brink of an early grave, we can feel a sense of superiority about our modern medicine and longer average lifespans. It allows us to view history as a simpler, more brutal time, devoid of the complex experiences that come with age, wisdom, long-term planning, the management of chronic illness, the joys of seeing multiple generations of a family grow. But the reality is that ancient people did worry about retirement. Roman soldiers were given pensions in the form of land grants. They did write advice for their grandchildren. Think of the vast body of philosophical works aimed at guiding a full life. They did experience the aches and pains of getting older. Medical texts from Egypt to China are filled with remedies for joint pain, failing eyesight, and other ailments of age. Recognizing that people in the past also lived long lives makes them more human, more relatable. It forces us to see their societies as complex structures that had to account for elders, inheritance, and the transfer of knowledge from one generation to the next, just as we do today. This corrected view doesn't diminish the very real hardships and dangers they faced. Instead, it adds a layer of depth and resilience to their story, reminding us that the human capacity for survival and the desire for a long life is a timeless constant, not a modern luxury. This powerful image of flames consuming those accused of witchcraft is seared into our collective imagination, a scene we instinctively associate with the infamous panic in Salem. Yet this harrowing detail is a complete historical misplacement, a case of our memory merging two distinct horrors into one. The truth of the Salem witch trials is grim enough without the fiery embellishment. In the tense, paroxysmal year of 1692 in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 20 people were executed for the crime of witchcraft, but the method was not fire. 19 of these victims, the vast majority, were taken to a place called Gallows Hill and hanged. The 20th, an elderly farmer named Giles Corey, met an even more gruesome and unique fate. Refusing to enter a plea to the charges against him, a strategic move to prevent his farm from being confiscated by the state, he was subjected to peine forte et dure, or pressing to death. Heavy stones were piled upon his body in an attempt to force a plea, and his legendary, defiant last words were reportedly, "More weight." This is the documented reality of Salem's executions, a reality of ropes and stones, not of stakes and pyres. So how did this potent association with burning become so inextricably linked to Salem? The confusion arises from a transatlantic mix-up, a blurring of European and American history. Across the ocean, particularly in regions like Germany and Scotland, where witch hunt fervor reached its most intense pitch, execution by burning at the stake was indeed the preferred method. This practice was rooted in a specific theological and legal logic. Burning was seen as a form of purification, utterly destroying the body of the heretic or witch to prevent any possibility of resurrection and to purge the evil from the community. It was also the punishment mandated for heresy under the legal codes influenced by the Holy Roman Empire. When we picture a witch burning, we are drawing on this very real and widespread European tradition where tens of thousands met their end in this horrific manner. American popular culture, from plays like Arthur Miller's The Crucible to countless films and television shows, has consistently and incorrectly imported this European imagery into the New England setting. The visual drama of fire is simply more cinematic and symbolically charged than the bleak, straightforward horror of the gallows, leading generations of artists and writers to prioritize emotional impact over historical accuracy. This conflation is more than a simple factual error. It's a fascinating case study in how collective memory works. Over time, the specific details of different but related historical events can bleed into one another, creating a composite, simplified narrative that loses the nuance of each individual story. The unique legal and cultural contours of the Salem episode, a brief, intense outburst of Puritan panic in a specific colonial context, get smoothed over and absorbed into a broader, more generalized European narrative of witch persecution. We remember the shared theme of witch trial, but forget the crucial local details of how that terror was enacted. This process of generalization distorts the past, making it less specific and therefore less understandable. It prevents us from asking the right questions. Why did New Englanders choose hanging when Europeans so often chose fire? The answer lies in English common law, which the colonists carried with them. In England and its American colonies, witchcraft was treated as a felony, a civil crime punishable by hanging, not as heresy, which was an ecclesiastical crime punishable by burning. This critical legal distinction gets completely erased when we imagine universal flames. Insisting on this precise historical truth is not just pedantic fact-checking. It is an act of respect for the victims and a crucial step toward understanding the real mechanisms of fear and injustice. By correcting this detail, we are forced to engage with the Salem witch trials on their own terms, in their specific time and place. We see a community gripped by a perfect storm of frontier anxiety, economic tensions, rivalries between families, and a rigid religious worldview that genuinely believed the devil was actively recruiting in their midst. The accusations, the spectral evidence, the coerced confessions, these are the real horrors of Salem, and they are complex, human tragedies that deserve to be studied in their authentic context, not obscured by a misplaced and more dramatic symbol from another continent. Getting the method of execution right is the first step in getting the history right, pulling aside a curtain of myth to reveal the sobering, and in many ways more terrifying, reality of how ordinary people can become caught in a vortex of mass hysteria with deadly and historically misremembered consequences. This pervasive idea of a medieval church violently opposing the very notion of a round earth is a story we've all heard, a classic tale of religious dogma crushing scientific truth. We picture dogmatic monks burning maps and excommunicating anyone who dared suggest the world wasn't flat, all to maintain their grip on a geocentric universe. But this dramatic showdown is almost entirely a fiction, a historical mirage created centuries after the fact. The genuine story is far less black and white, revealing a long and surprisingly supportive relationship between the church and the science of cosmology that gets completely erased by the flat earth myth. The reality is that educated people throughout the Middle Ages, including the most devout churchmen, knew the earth was a sphere. This knowledge was never lost. It was passed down directly from the ancient Greeks through the scholarly work of the church itself. Early Christian thinkers like Augustine in the 4th century and Bede in the 8th century explicitly discussed the earth's spherical shape in their writings. Thomas Aquinas, the immense theological mind of the 13th century, used the earth's roundness as a standard, accepted fact in his arguments. The textbooks used in medieval universities, the centers of learning run by the church, taught spherical earth geometry as a fundamental part of the curriculum. The Venerable Bede even calculated the circumference of the earth using the methods of the ancient Greeks. For 1,000 years, the concept was simply not a point of doctrinal contention. The issue wasn't the shape of the earth, but its place in the cosmos. This is where the real conflict arose, and it's best exemplified by the Galileo affair, which is often misrepresented as the Church denying a round Earth. Galileo's trouble wasn't about the Earth being round. It was about his forceful advocacy for a heliocentric model, where the Earth moves around the Sun, challenging the Ptolemaic geocentric system that had been accepted for over a millennium. This challenge was seismic, threatening to upend not just astronomy but philosophy, theology, and physics. The Church's reaction, while certainly an overreach and an error in hindsight, was not a simple-minded rejection of science. It was a conservative institution attempting to manage a radical new idea that seemed to contradict both established science, as the Ptolemaic system was, and a literal reading of certain biblical passages. Furthermore, Galileo's own combative personality and his tactic of mocking the Pope in his writings turned a scientific debate into a personal and political feud, ensuring a harsh reaction from the authorities. It was a complex clash of new evidence, old interpretations, and powerful egos, not a straightforward case of faith versus fact. So how did the flat Earth myth become so entrenched? Its origins are surprisingly modern, rooted in the intellectual battles of the 19th century. Authors like Washington Irving, with his fictionalized account of Columbus, and later, vocal proponents of scientific naturalism like John William Draper and Andrew Dixon White, actively promoted this narrative. They were fighting their own war against religious influence in a rapidly modernizing world, and they needed a powerful founding myth for their cause. By painting the medieval church as a monolithic enemy of reason and progress, they could position modern science as the heroic liberator of human thought. The flat Earth became a perfect, easily understood symbol of this supposed darkness, a darkness that their enlightenment had vanquished. This fabricated history was a potent rhetorical tool, used to argue that religion was inherently opposed to scientific inquiry and must be removed from the public sphere. It was a useful lie for a specific cultural moment, but a lie nonetheless. Dismantling this falsehood does more than just correct the historical record. It allows us to see the nuanced and often collaborative relationship between faith and science for what it truly was. Throughout the Middle Ages, the Church was the primary patron of learning, preserving ancient knowledge in its monasteries and founding the first universities where natural philosophy, the precursor to modern science, was studied. Many of the era's greatest astronomers and mathematicians were clergymen who saw their work as a way to understand the grandeur of God's creation. The real history is not one of constant warfare but of interplay, with periods of tension certainly, but also long stretches of mutual support and shared inquiry. Recognizing this complexity liberates us from a simplistic and divisive narrative, allowing for a more honest and productive conversation about how different ways of understanding the world can coexist and even inform one another, a theme that continues to resonate deeply in our own time. For centuries, the image of thousands of slaves toiling under the lash to build the pyramids has been one of history's most enduring and somber tableaus, a story seemingly set in stone by both Hollywood epics and traditional textbooks. This narrative of brutal oppression and forced labor feels intuitively true, painting the pyramids as magnificent monuments built on a foundation of human misery. But groundbreaking archaeological discoveries over the past few decades have completely overturned this bleak picture, revealing a story of the pyramid builders that is not one of coercion, but of astonishing social organization, skilled craftsmanship, and even national pride. The turning point in this historical understanding came from a simple but profound discovery, not in the shadow of the Great Pyramid itself, but in the surrounding desert. In the 1990s, renowned Egyptologist Dr. Zahi Hawass and his team began excavating a vast cemetery near the Giza Plateau, a burial ground long overlooked because it was assumed to be for common slaves. What they unearthed was nothing short of revolutionary. They found the tombs of the workers themselves, and the way these individuals were buried spoke volumes about their status. These were not shallow pits for discarded laborers. These were proper, respectful tombs, some even adorned with small, decorated chapels. Within them, skeletons were found in a flexed position, surrounded by jars that once held beer and bread for their journey to the afterlife, provisions that held deep religious significance. Most tellingly, the inscriptions on some of the tombs identified the occupants with titles like Friend of Khufu, the very pharaoh for whom the Great Pyramid was built. This is not the language or treatment reserved for a despised and oppressed slave class. Further analysis of the skeletal remains added another layer of compelling evidence. Studies by archaeologists and physical anthropologists revealed that these workers received sophisticated medical care. They found healed fractures, some so well set that the individuals would have regained full mobility, suggesting they were cared for during a long convalescence rather than being left to die. The bones also showed signs of the physical stress of their work, arthritis in the joints and wear on the vertebrae from carrying heavy loads, but these were the bodies of people who were fed, healed, and valued for their labor. This picture is reinforced by the discovery of nearby bakeries and breweries capable of producing food on an industrial scale, enough to feed a rotating workforce of thousands. The logistics suggest a state-organized project, more akin to a national works program than a slave-driven operation. Perhaps the most humanizing evidence comes from the workers themselves, scrawled on the very stones they placed. In hidden corners of the pyramid's inner chambers, crews left graffiti identifying themselves with colorful, proud names like the Vigorous Gang, the Enduring Gang, or the Craftsman Gang. These are not the marks of a broken, anonymous workforce. They are the boasts of skilled, organized teams who took ownership of their monumental task. The evidence points to a system where farmers from villages across Egypt were recruited to work during the annual inundation of the Nile, when their fields were underwater and farming was impossible. In return for their labor, they were compensated with food, clothing, shelter, and likely tax exemptions. This was a clever way for the state to harness idle manpower for a national project while providing for its people, creating a cycle of labor that benefited both the pharaoh and the populace. So how did the slave labor myth become so dominant? Its roots are largely cultural and biblical. The Book of Exodus's powerful story of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt cast a long shadow over Western perceptions of ancient Egyptian society. For centuries, European and American scholars, steeped in this biblical tradition, simply assumed the pyramids must have been built by these enslaved people, projecting that narrative onto the archaeological record without physical evidence. Furthermore, this view was convenient for later eras. It allowed modern observers to look back at an ancient, non-Western civilization and judge it as fundamentally cruel and despotic, thereby reinforcing a sense of their own moral and societal progress. It was easier to attribute these wonders to the whip of a tyrant than to acknowledge the complex, collaborative achievement they truly represent. Understanding the truth transforms the pyramids from cold, impersonal tombs into a testament to human cooperation and ingenuity. They were not built by a desperate mob, but by a highly organized society that could mobilize, feed, and care for a massive workforce with stunning efficiency. This reevaluation forces us to appreciate the ancient Egyptians not as cruel taskmasters, but as brilliant managers and engineers who understood how to motivate and sustain a long-term national project. The pyramids stand not as a memorial to oppression, but as a lasting monument to what a coordinated, purposeful society can achieve when its people work together toward a common or inspiring goal. We've all seen the cinematic depictions of the Middle Ages, a world caked in mud where peasants in filthy rags wade through streets flowing with waste, and everyone is seemingly permanently grimy. It's a visceral image that reinforces our notion of this era as a backward, unpleasant time, a stark contrast to our modern, sanitized world. But this popular portrait of universal medieval filth is a grimy layer of exaggeration and misconception that needs to be scrubbed away. The reality of hygiene in the Middle Ages was far more nuanced, a complex tapestry of practical efforts, cultural values, and evolving practices that often gets completely overlooked in favor of the simpler, dirtier story. Let's start with the most damning evidence against the myth, the widespread presence of public bathhouses. Contrary to the idea that people never bathed, medieval cities were often well equipped with communal baths, known as stews or bagnios. In London, records from the 13th century show a thriving industry of bathhouses along the Thames, where citizens could pay for a hot soak, a scrub, and even have their clothes laundered. In Paris, the étuves were so popular they were taxed by the crown, and in German towns like Baden-Baden, natural hot springs made bathing a central social activity. These were not just functional places to get clean, they were vibrant community hubs where people gathered to socialize, conduct business, and even enjoy a meal and a drink. The idea that everyone was walking around in a permanent state of grime simply doesn't hold up when you consider that for a penny, a Londoner could have a thorough wash. Personal grooming was also highly valued. Combs, often made of wood or ivory, are among the most common artifacts found in archaeological digs from the period. Manuscript illustrations frequently show people washing their hands and faces before meals, and etiquette manuals from the time place a strong emphasis on cleanliness, advising against spitting at the table or blowing one's nose into one's hand. They might not have had antibacterial soap, but they used what they had: water, herbs, and coarse lye soap, to maintain a standard of personal cleanliness that was important to them. So how did this powerful myth of a stinking, filthy past take such a strong hold? Its origins are less about medieval reality and more about the rhetorical needs of later eras. The thinkers of the Renaissance, eager to promote their own era as a rebirth of classical brilliance, had a vested interest in portraying the immediate past as a dark, dirty interlude. This narrative was turbocharged during the Enlightenment, when philosophers like Voltaire used the supposed filth and superstition of the Middle Ages as a convenient foil to highlight the enlightened cleanliness and reason of their own age. This contrast was a powerful tool for promoting progress and secularism. The myth was then cemented in the 19th century by the twin forces of the Industrial Revolution and new medical discoveries. Victorian cities were choked with soot and plagued by overcrowding and genuine public health crises. At the same time, scientists like Louis Pasteur were proving the germ theory of disease. Looking back through this new lens of miasma and microbes, Victorians projected their own fears of urban filth onto the medieval period, imagining it as an even worse version of their own problems. They saw the absence of modern sanitation and misinterpreted it as a complete absence of any hygiene at all, unable to conceive of a different system of cleanliness. This condescending view causes us to profoundly misinterpret the medieval relationship with cleanliness. We judge them by our standards, failing to see their own sophisticated, if different, approaches. Yes, a medieval street might have had more visible waste than a modern one, but that's because they had a different waste management system, one that often involved pigs and roaming dogs acting as organic waste disposals. They lacked an understanding of germs, but they intuitively connected foul smells with disease, which is why many towns had laws requiring butchers and tanners to operate downstream from the main population centers. Their concept of cleanliness was also deeply intertwined with religious and social ritual. Washing a guest's feet was an act of humble hospitality, and bathing before major religious festivals was a common practice. To dismiss them as simply dirty is to ignore the logic and intention behind their actions. Recognizing the true state of medieval hygiene does more than just correct a historical error. It challenges our ingrained sense of superiority. It forces us to admit that our ancestors were not primitive brutes but pragmatic people doing their best with the knowledge and resources they had. They valued cleanliness, they worked to achieve it, and their efforts, however different from our own, were part of a continuous human struggle for health and order that connects their time to ours. Of all the historical falsehoods we've explored, few have been as foundational to our modern worldview as the story of Christopher Columbus discovering America. This single phrase, repeated in countless schoolrooms and history books, carries with it an immense and misleading weight, quietly shaping perceptions of the entire Western Hemisphere for over 5 centuries. To say that Columbus discovered America is to perform a breathtaking act of historical erasure, effectively wiping the slate of human history clean for tens of millions of people who had already built complex, thriving civilizations across 2 continents for thousands of years. Imagine for a moment the sheer scale of what this myth ignores. When Columbus's ships made landfall in the Bahamas in 1492, they did not find an empty, virgin wilderness. They arrived in a world that was already ancient, a land crisscrossed by trade routes, dotted with bustling cities, and cultivated by sophisticated agricultural societies. The Taino people who greeted Columbus on the beach had their own rich culture, language, and social structures, a reality he himself noted in his journals, describing them as a people of generosity and intelligence, though he would soon subject them to horrific violence and enslavement. To the north, vast networks of native nations like the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy had already established a powerful democratic government that would later influence the American founding fathers. In the Andes, the Inca Empire was the largest nation on Earth, with an intricate system of roads and terraced agriculture that rivaled anything in Europe. And in Mesoamerica, the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan was a gleaming metropolis built on a lake, with soaring temples, bustling markets, and aqueducts providing fresh water, a city far larger and more organized than most contemporary European capitals. This was not a new world waiting to be found. It was an old world teeming with its own history, its own discoveries, and its own people. This persistent myth also conveniently sidesteps the fact that Columbus was not even the first European to cross the Atlantic and make contact. That distinction belongs to the Norse explorers, led by Leif Erikson, who established a short-lived settlement at Elance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland around the year 1000. Nearly 5 centuries before Columbus set sail. While their presence was fleeting and did not lead to lasting colonization, their voyages are well documented in Norse sagas and confirmed by modern archaeology. The story of Columbus as the sole pioneering discoverer requires us to willfully ignore this earlier chapter, another example of how a simplified narrative steamrolls over inconvenient complexities to create a more heroic and singular origin story. Perhaps the most ironic layer of this lie is that Columbus himself never believed he had discovered a new continent. He died convinced that he had successfully reached the outer islands of Asia, which was his stated goal all along. He called the indigenous people he encountered Indios or Indians, a misnomer born of this fundamental error that persists to this day. His voyages were a monumental navigational feat, but they were based on a critical miscalculation of the Earth's circumference and a stubborn refusal to accept the evidence before him that he had stumbled upon something entirely unknown to Europe. He was not a visionary discoverer but a lost, though determined, navigator clinging to an outdated map. So why has this particular lie proven so incredibly durable? The answer lies in its immense political utility. The myth of discovery was not an innocent mistake. It was a legal and philosophical cornerstone for the entire project of European colonization. By framing the Americas as a new world devoid of prior civilized ownership, European powers could invoke the doctrine of discovery, a principle in international law that granted them the right to claim and occupy lands they discovered that were not inhabited by Christians. This legal fiction effectively transformed the vibrant, existing nations of the Americas into nullities, their long histories and sovereign rights instantly erased on paper. This provided the moral and legal justification for seizing land, extracting resources, and subjugating populations, all under the guise of bringing civilization and Christianity to a supposedly empty wilderness. It was a story crafted by the winners to legitimize their actions and write the original inhabitants out of their own history, a process that made the violence of conquest seem like a natural, even inevitable, progression rather than a brutal invasion. This narrative was carefully maintained for centuries, serving nationalist agendas and creating a shared origin story for new American nations that centered European heroism while marginalizing the trauma and resilience of indigenous peoples. Unraveling this lie is not just an academic exercise, it is an essential act of historical justice, a step toward acknowledging the full, complex tapestry of the American past and honoring the enduring presence and contributions of native cultures that were here long before Columbus and are still here today. When we picture the ancient Olympics today, many of us might imagine noble Greek amateurs, wealthy men of leisure competing purely for the honor of the olive wreath and the glory of their city-states, a world away from the big money contracts and professional endorsements of modern sports. This idealized vision of athletic purity, however, is a complete fiction, a romantic projection from the 19th century that has little to do with the gritty, high-stakes reality of the original games. The ancient Olympic competitor was far from an amateur. He was often a highly specialized, state-funded professional for whom victory could mean immense wealth, lifelong fame, and a permanent place in the social elite. The evidence for this professional reality is overwhelming and comes from the ancient sources themselves. While the official prize at Olympia was indeed a simple wreath made from a sacred olive tree, the real rewards came after the victory parade. A returning Olympic champion could expect a hero's welcome and staggering material benefits from his home city. These were not mere tokens of appreciation, they were life-changing sums. The Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed that an Olympic winner would receive a payment of 500 drachmas, an absolute fortune at the time. Other cities offered equally lavish incentives, free meals for life at public expense, the best seats at all civic and religious events, and sometimes even exemption from taxes for the rest of their lives. In some cases, the city would literally tear down a section of its defensive walls to welcome the champion home, declaring that a city which produced such men had no need of walls for protection. This was the equivalent of a modern athlete signing a multi-million-dollar contract the moment they won a gold medal. The line between amateur and professional wasn't just blurred. It was a concept that simply didn't exist in the ancient Greek sporting world. These athletes were the rock stars of their era, and they trained and competed with a professional's intensity. They hired specialized coaches, followed strict dietary regimens, and utilized advanced training techniques. The most famous athletes, like the wrestler Milo of Croton, who won 6 Olympic victories, became legendary figures whose names were known across the Greek world. Poets composed odes in their honor, sculptors immortalized them in bronze and marble, and their feats of strength and skill were recounted for generations. This celebrity status translated directly into economic power. A victorious athlete could leverage his fame into lucrative appearance fees at other games, which were held all across Greece. He could become a highly paid coach for the next generation or even a political leader, his athletic glory lending him immense credibility and influence. For these men, sport was not a hobby, it was a career path, and a potentially glorious one at that. So how did this clear history of professionalism get whitewashed into the myth of the noble amateur? The answer lies in the drawing rooms of 19th-century England. The modern Olympic movement was founded by Baron Pierre de Coubertin, but he was heavily influenced by the British aristocracy's love for amateur sports. At English public schools and universities, athletic competition was promoted as a way to build character, sportsmanship, and gentlemanly virtue, but only if it was pursued without any taint of monetary gain. This ideal was a product of its time, reflecting a class-based disdain for the working classes who had to be paid to play. The upper-class amateurs saw professionalism as vulgar and corrupting. When these Victorian gentlemen looked back at ancient Greece, they didn't see it for what it was. They saw a mirror. They projected their own values onto the past, inventing a classical precedent for their amateur ethos. They latched onto the symbol of the olive wreath and ignored the vast wealth and professional status that followed, creating a purified, idealized version of history that served to legitimize their own contemporary sporting culture. This was not an attempt to accurately recreate the ancient games. It was an effort to claim the prestige of antiquity for a very modern set of elite values. This case is a perfect example of how we often remake the past in our own image, smoothing over its inconvenient complexities to create a simpler, more flattering origin story for our present-day ideals. This particular falsehood is so pervasive it has been printed in school textbooks and repeated by tour guides for generations. The claim that the Great Wall of China is the one human-made structure visible to the naked eye from space or even from the surface of the moon. It's a captivating idea, a testament to the wall's sheer immensity, but every astronaut who has actually looked back at our planet from orbit has confirmed it is simply not true. From low Earth orbit, roughly 250 miles up, the Great Wall is incredibly difficult to discern. Its construction materials, stone, brick, and earth, blend seamlessly with the natural colors and contours of the surrounding mountains and deserts. It is far narrower than runways or major highways, which are themselves challenging to spot without aid. And from the moon, 250,000 miles away, the entire Earth is little more than a beautiful blue and white marble, with no human structures visible at all. The myth is a powerful one, but it dissolves completely against the cold, hard reality of orbital mechanics and human visual perception. The origins of this story are a fascinating study in how national pride and a good narrative can override factual accuracy. The idea seems to have first gained widespread traction not in China but in the West. In 1894, an American magazine called The Century published a speculative piece suggesting that the Great Wall might be the only human work visible from the moon, a notion that was purely hypothetical at the time. This seed of an idea found fertile ground. It was repeated and amplified over the decades because it served a purpose. It provided a stunning, easily graspable symbol for the wall's legendary scale. For Western audiences, it framed the wall as the ultimate human achievement, a superlative that captured the imagination. In China, the myth was later embraced and propagated as a point of immense national pride, a symbol of the nation's ancient ingenuity and enduring strength. It became a staple of patriotic education, a fact so poetic and grand that it felt like it should be true, and so it was repeated in classrooms and media until it became an unquestioned article of faith for millions around the world. But in our desire to attribute this almost supernatural quality to the wall, we ironically diminish its true and far more impressive significance. The real wonder of the Great Wall isn't that it might be seen from another celestial body. It's that it was built at all, here on Earth, by millions of hands over 2 millennia. This is not a single wall, but a sprawling network of fortifications, walls, trenches, and natural barriers snaking over 13,000 miles across some of the most treacherous and varied terrain on the planet. Its construction is a staggering feat of logistics, engineering, and raw human determination. Quarrying and moving the immense amount of stone and brick, organizing the labor and feeding the armies of workers, and designing a structure that could withstand both invaders and the elements across deserts and mountain peaks. These are the true marvels. The wall is a testament to sophisticated administrative skill and breathtaking adaptability, changing its construction methods to suit the local availability of materials, from packed earth in the western deserts to finely cut stone blocks in the eastern mountains. To focus on the false space-based view is to miss the profound earthly achievement right in front of us. It would be like praising a Nobel Prize-winning novel solely for the length of its chapters rather than the beauty of its prose and the depth of its ideas. Ultimately, the journey of this myth from speculation to common belief to eventual debunking serves as a perfect microcosm for our entire exploration of historical falsehoods. It teaches us to value the authentic wonder over the exaggerated myth, the reality of the Great Wall as a complex and evolving system of defense born from genuine strategic need and incredible human effort, is infinitely more interesting and inspiring than the cartoonish image of a single line visible from the moon. It grounds the wall in its real history of conflict, diplomacy, and cultural exchange, reminding us that its true purpose was not to be seen from afar, but to control movement and protect a civilization down here on the ground. Letting go of the easier, more fantastical story allows us to engage with the richer, more complicated, and ultimately more human truth. It challenges us to appreciate historical wonders for what they genuinely are, not as simple symbols for our admiration, but as complex products of their time, whose real stories are always more compelling than the myths we layer upon them. Imagine for a moment the scene in a bustling medieval marketplace. A wealthy merchant carefully selects a small, precious sack of peppercorns, paying for it with a significant amount of silver. He isn't purchasing this expensive luxury to pour over a side of spoiled beef. He's acquiring a status symbol, a medicinal ingredient, and a way to create a spectacular dish for an important feast that will impress his guests and display his immense wealth. This is the reality that completely demolishes the persistent myth that spices were used to mask the taste of rotten meat. The very economics of the medieval world make this idea absurd. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were among the most expensive commodities available, imported along treacherous trade routes that stretched all the way from India and the Spice Islands. They were worth their weight in gold, quite literally. If a person could afford these exorbitantly priced luxuries, they absolutely could afford fresh, high-quality meat. Using priceless saffron to disguise cheap, rotten meat would be like using a bottle of vintage champagne to clean a dirty floor, a senseless and extravagant waste of a precious resource. So what were these spices actually for? Their uses were far more sophisticated and reveal a complex medieval worldview. First and foremost, they were a powerful display of social status and wealth. Serving heavily spiced food was a form of conspicuous consumption, a way to show your guests that you had the means to acquire the finest things the world had to offer. The more exotic and pungent the spice blend, the greater the host's perceived power and prestige. Beyond sheer opulence, spices were deeply entwined with medieval medicine and science. Based on the ancient Gaelic humoral theory, which held that health depended on a balance of 4 bodily humors, foods and spices were classified by their properties. Many spices were considered hot and dry, making them ideal for balancing cold and wet conditions or for aiding digestion. A spiced wine wasn't just a tasty beverage, it was a digestive tonic. Furthermore, the intense flavors were genuinely enjoyed. Medieval palates appreciated complex, sharp, and highly seasoned tastes, often combining sweet, savory, and spicy elements in ways that might surprise our modern tongues. Their cuisine was not a desperate attempt to choke down rotten fare, but a deliberate and creative culinary tradition. The origins of this smelly myth are a classic case of modern misinterpretation. It likely stems from a later era looking back and misunderstanding medieval recipes and practices. We see instructions for heavy spicing and assume it must be to cover something up, because that's how we would use strong flavors today. This view was eagerly adopted and amplified during the Enlightenment and Victorian eras. Thinkers of these periods had a vested interest in portraying the Middle Ages as a filthy, primitive, and backward time, a dark contrast to their own enlightened and civilized age. The image of ignorant medieval people gagging down spoiled meat fit perfectly into this narrative of progress, making their own era seem advanced and hygienic by comparison. It was a convenient, if condescending, story that reinforced a sense of superiority. Unraveling this lie does more than just correct a culinary error. It forces us to recognize the sophistication of medieval trade networks that spanned continents, the complexity of their medical and scientific beliefs, and the intentional artistry of their cooking. It replaces a caricature of grubby, desperate people with a picture of a society capable of refinement, global connection, and enjoying the finer things in life, challenging our simplistic assumptions about what life was like 1,000 years ago. The iconic image of the American West is one we all know instantly: a dusty main street under a blistering sun, where squint-eyed gunslingers face off at high noon, lawmen are corrupt or powerless, and justice is delivered from the barrel of a gun. This vision of a perpetually lawless and violent frontier has been burned into our collective consciousness by countless Hollywood westerns, pulp novels, and folklore. But this dramatic portrait is largely a work of fiction, a caricature that says more about the anxieties and entertainment desires of later generations than it does about the actual lived experience of the West. The reality was far more complex, orderly, and frankly, more boring than the myth would have us believe. To understand the real West, we have to look past the silver screen and into the mundane, practical records of everyday life. While infamous boomtowns like Deadwood or Tombstone did experience periods of intense violence, they were the exception, not the rule. Most settlements were established not by outlaws, but by families, farmers, ranchers, and entrepreneurs who had a vested interest in stability and order. As soon as a town was founded, one of its first orders of business was often to establish a form of governance, electing a sheriff or marshal, forming a town council, and creating a legal code. These weren't just suggestions, they were enforced. Court records from Western towns show a robust and surprisingly busy legal system, handling everything from land disputes and contract law to minor misdemeanors. People sued each other, they served on juries, and they used the court system to resolve conflicts, much as they did back east. the famous gunfight at the O.K. Corral, for instance, was not a random act of lawlessness but a violent enforcement of a local ordinance against carrying firearms in town, a clash between a legally deputized group and men who were breaking the law. The data on violence itself is particularly revealing. Historians who have studied homicide rates have found that many famous Western towns were far less deadly than the industrial cities of the East during the same period. In the latter half of the 19th century, the murder rate in New York City was significantly higher than in Dodge City, Kansas, a place synonymous with frontier lawlessness. In fact, the average cowboy was far more likely to be injured in a cattle stampede or a barroom brawl than in a dramatic shootout. The myth of constant Indian warfare is also greatly exaggerated. While conflict certainly occurred, many more interactions between settlers and native tribes were based on trade, negotiation, and often cautious coexistence. The narrative of perpetual war served to justify military expansion and land acquisition, but it oversimplifies a long and varied history of interaction. So why did this myth of the wild and violent West become so dominant? Its primary architects were the dime novelists of the late 19th century and the early filmmakers of the 20th. Writers like Ned Buntline took real figures such as Wild Bill Hickok and Buffalo Bill Cody and transformed them into larger-than-life superheroes, embellishing their exploits with incredible feats of gunplay and daring. These cheap, sensational novels sold by the millions, creating a hungry market for thrilling stories of the recently closed frontier. When Hollywood emerged, it seized upon this ready-made genre. The Western provided a perfect framework for simple stories of good versus evil, set against a dramatic landscape. It was easier to sell tickets to a film about a dramatic gunfight than about the slow, difficult work of building irrigation canals or establishing a school board. This romanticized version celebrated a specific kind of rugged, individualistic masculinity that resonated deeply with American ideals, even as it became increasingly distant from modern, urban life. This fabricated history had real consequences. It helped forge a national identity centered on self-reliance and the conquest of wilderness, which was then used to justify the continued expansion of American influence. By portraying the West as an empty land tamed by heroic individuals, it erased the complex communities that were already there and the collective efforts required to build new ones. The truth is, the West was built not by lone gunmen, but by cooperation, by barn raisings, by women's clubs that established libraries and hospitals, by farming cooperatives, and by religious congregations that provided social cohesion. It was a place of contracts and deeds, of weddings and harvest festivals, of quiet hard work far more often than it was a place of spectacular violence. Recognizing this doesn't make the history less compelling. It makes it more human. It replaces a simplistic fantasy with a richer, more honest story of community, perseverance, and the unglamorous, everyday work of building a society from the ground up. This widespread belief that our ancestors universally cowered before a storm, interpreting every lightning strike as a direct expression of divine fury, is another oversimplification that robs the past of its intellectual richness. It's true that many cultures wove lightning into their mythologies. The Norse had Thor and his mighty hammer Mjolnir, the Greeks had Zeus hurling his thunderbolts, and the Romans had Jupiter wielding his lightning spear. These powerful stories gave meaning to a terrifying and unpredictable natural force, providing a framework for understanding the world. But to assume that this mythological layer represented the entirety of ancient thought is to ignore a parallel and deeply significant thread of inquiry, one that sought rational, natural explanations for the very same phenomena. Long before the advent of modern meteorology, brilliant minds were meticulously observing the weather and proposing theories that were grounded in logic and empirical observation. In the 4th century BC, the Greek philosopher Aristotle dedicated significant thought to the problem of atmospheric disturbances. In his work Meteorology, he didn't attribute lightning to Zeus's anger. Instead, he proposed a detailed physical theory. He suggested that lightning was a massive, high-temperature exhalation of wind from clouds, a blazing fire that was extinguished by the surrounding damp air, creating the accompanying sound of thunder. While his specific mechanism was incorrect, his approach was fundamentally scientific. He was observing, hypothesizing, and attempting to explain nature through natural causes, not supernatural ones. He wasn't an isolated outlier either. Other pre-Socratic philosophers like Anaximander and Empedocles also put forward naturalistic theories for weather events, trying to understand the world as a system of interacting elements rather than a playground for capricious gods. This false narrative that everyone in the past was mired in superstitious ignorance gained traction for the same reason many of these historical lies persist. It served a useful purpose for a later age. During the scientific revolution and especially the Enlightenment, thinkers were engaged in a fierce battle to establish the authority of reason and empirical science. To make their new world seem more revolutionary and triumphant, they needed a dark adversary to contrast it with. They constructed a straw man of the past, portraying it as a monolithic era of irrational fear and religious dogma. By claiming that all ancient people saw lightning only as godly wrath, they could position themselves as the enlightened heroes who had finally banished the shadows of superstition with the bright light of science. This was a powerful, if dishonest, rhetorical strategy. It created a clean, satisfying story of progress from primitive fear to modern understanding, but it did so by erasing the nuanced reality of historical thought. The truth is that for most of human history, religious or mythological explanations and naturalistic inquiries existed side by side, often within the same person or culture, without the sense of contradiction we might feel today. A farmer might pray to Jupiter for protection from a storm while also understanding the practical signs that one was approaching. A scholar like Aristotle could write extensively on the natural causes of weather while still participating in the religious festivals of his city. These were not mutually exclusive ways of seeing the world. They were different tools for engaging with its mysteries, each fulfilling a different human need. One provided meaning, community, and a connection to the divine. The other satisfied a deep-seated curiosity about how things worked, a drive to uncover the mechanics of the universe. Recognizing this complexity is crucial because it shatters the simplistic and condescending myth of a linear march from superstition to science. It reveals a much more fascinating history of human curiosity, one where the desire to explain and understand has always been a fundamental part of our species, manifesting in diverse and creative ways long before we had the instruments to prove our theories correct. The notion that the Renaissance exploded onto the scene like a sudden sunrise, instantly burning away the thousand-year gloom of the so-called Dark Ages, is one of history's most compelling and enduring storylines. We are taught to envision a clean, dramatic break, a moment where humanity collectively shook off its medieval shackles and rediscovered the light of classical reason, art, and science. It's a satisfying narrative of awakening, but it is a story that was carefully crafted by the very people who lived through the era, a piece of brilliant self-promotion that has distorted our understanding of cultural change for centuries. The truth is far less sudden and far more interesting. The Renaissance was not a spontaneous rebirth, but the flowering of seeds that had been patiently sown and cultivated throughout the Middle Ages, a gradual transformation deeply indebted to the intellectual currents flowing from the Islamic world and the enduring legacy of the Byzantine Empire. To understand this, we must first look at the myth's architects, the Renaissance humanists themselves. Thinkers like Petrarch and Vasari actively promoted the idea that they were living in a new age, a rinascita or rebirth, following a long period of cultural barrenness. Petrarch famously dismissed the preceding centuries as an age of darkness, a time when the glorious achievements of Rome and Greece had been forgotten. This wasn't an objective historical analysis, it was a powerful rhetorical move. By creating a stark contrast with a supposedly backward past, these scholars could magnify the brilliance of their own work and that of their contemporaries. They were, in effect, building their own pedestal by first tearing down the foundations of what came before. Later historians, particularly those of the Enlightenment who were eager to champion their own era's reason and progress, enthusiastically amplified this narrative. It created a clean, heroic story of progress that was easy to teach and satisfying to believe, a story where the modern world was born in a single, glorious moment in 14th century Italy. But if we wipe away this self-congratulatory veneer, a very different picture emerges, one of continuous evolution rather than sudden revolution. Many of the very pillars of the so-called Renaissance were, in fact, medieval inventions. The university system, that great engine of intellectual inquiry, was a creation of the High Middle Ages. The pointed arches and flying buttresses of Gothic cathedrals were breathtaking feats of engineering that required sophisticated mathematical knowledge. The philosophical framework of scholasticism, often unfairly caricatured as mere hair-splitting, developed rigorous tools of logic and debate that would be essential for future scientific inquiry. The Italian city-states like Florence and Venice, which would become the epicenters of Renaissance culture, didn't spring up overnight. Their wealth, republican ideals, and civic pride were built over centuries of medieval trade, banking, and political negotiation. The Renaissance didn't emerge from a vacuum. It stood on the sturdy and sophisticated shoulders of the medieval world. Perhaps the most crucial and overlooked element of this story is the immense debt owed to the Islamic world. While Western Europe was reorganizing after the fall of Rome, scholars in the vast Islamic empire, stretching from Spain to Persia, were engaged in a monumental project of preservation and innovation. They didn't just store the works of Aristotle, Plato, Ptolemy, and Galen in libraries. They actively translated, debated, and expanded upon them. In great centers of learning like the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, advancements in algebra by al-Khwarizmi, in optics by Ibn al-Haytham, and in medicine by Avicenna pushed human knowledge to new heights. When European scholars began their rediscovery of classical texts, they were often not reading the original Greek or Latin, but Latin translations of Arabic commentaries. The very numerals we use today, a fundamental tool for science and commerce, are called Arabic numerals for a reason. They were introduced to Europe through these Islamic scholarly networks. The intellectual ferment of the Renaissance was fueled by a cross-cultural exchange that had been ongoing for centuries, a dialogue that flowed through the bustling ports of the Mediterranean and the dusty caravan routes of the Silk Road. Simultaneously, the fading light of the Byzantine Empire provided another critical spark. As the Ottoman Turks closed in on Constantinople, Byzantine scholars fled westward, carrying with them precious ancient Greek manuscripts that had been preserved in the East for a millennium. These texts and the scholars who could read them provided a direct link to Plato and Homer that had been weakened in the West, offering a new perspective that differed from the Aristotelian focus of medieval scholasticism. This influx of new, old knowledge was a catalyst, but it was a catalyst added to an already simmering mixture, not a lone spark igniting a pile of dry tinder. Seeing the Renaissance as a phase in a continuous evolution rather than a sudden revolution is more than just an academic correction. It fundamentally changes how we understand progress itself. It teaches us to look for the subtle continuities in history, the way ideas are borrowed, adapted, and repurposed across cultures and centuries. It challenges the simplistic, heroic narratives of lone geniuses single-handedly changing the world and replaces them with a more complex and collaborative picture of human achievement. This perspective reveals that cultural golden ages are never truly isolated events. They are always the product of long gestation, of forgotten precursors, and of a rich, often unacknowledged, exchange between civilizations. The real story of the Renaissance is not one of a sudden awakening, but of a brilliant synthesis, a moment when the accumulated knowledge of the medieval West, the Islamic world, and the Byzantine East finally converged to create an explosion of creativity whose echoes still shape our world today. And so we arrive at the final and perhaps most pervasive lie of all, a modern myth that wraps ancient wonder in a cloak of cosmic condescension, the idea that extraterrestrial visitors, not human hands, built the world's most magnificent monuments. This theory, popularized by television shows and speculative books, suggests that structures like the pyramids of Giza, Stonehenge, or the massive Moai heads of Easter Island are simply too advanced, too precise, or too massive to be the work of our ancestors. It's a seductive story offering a shortcut to mystery, but it is a story that, upon even the slightest examination, completely unravels, revealing not just a misunderstanding of history, but a deeply troubling assumption about the capabilities of ancient peoples. At its core, the ancient aliens narrative is built on a foundation of what archaeologists call technological disbelief. This is the inability to conceive that cultures without modern machinery or digital computers could possibly have engineered such splendors. Proponents point to the massive stones at Baalbek or the precise alignment of the Great Pyramid with true north and ask, how could they have possibly done this? But to ask this question is to reveal a profound ignorance of the archaeological record, which provides clear, compelling, and often astonishingly detailed answers. We have not only the finished monuments but also the quarries, the worker settlements, the experimental failed attempts, the discarded tools, and the trial trenches that map out the entire process of human ingenuity from conception to completion. At the pyramid site itself, we've found the remnants of the ramps and lever systems used to haul the massive blocks into place. At Stonehenge, we've discovered the exact quarry in Wales where the bluestones originated, and have even conducted modern experiments showing how teams of people could have transported them using sledges, rollers, and boats. These were not magical feats. They were monumental logistical projects, the ancient equivalent of a moonshot, requiring brilliant organization, generations of dedicated labor, and a deep, hard-won knowledge of engineering, astronomy, and stoneworking passed down through centuries. This leads us to the most damaging implication of this myth, an implication that is often unstated but always present, a lingering cultural and racial bias. The ancient aliens theory is overwhelmingly applied to the achievements of non-European, non-Western civilizations. Nobody seriously suggests that extraterrestrials built the Roman Colosseum, despite its own breathtaking engineering and scale. The intricate Gothic cathedrals of Europe, which took centuries to complete and required solving immense structural puzzles, are rightly celebrated as purely human achievements. But when the builders have brown skin, when they come from African, South American, or Polynesian cultures, the narrative suddenly shifts. Their accomplishments are mystified and taken from them, attributed instead to outside, otherworldly intervention. This is a modern form of the same colonialist mindset that for centuries refused to believe that Native Americans could have built the great earthworks of the Mississippi or that Africans could have founded great universities in Timbuktu. It is a refusal to grant these cultures the full measure of their own genius, a backhanded compliment that praises the monument while robbing the people of their rightful legacy. It is, in effect, a sophisticated form of denial, a way of saying, "This is wonderful, but you could not have done it." The persistence of this idea speaks to several deep-seated human desires. There is a natural fascination with the mysterious and the paranormal, a longing for a history that is more exciting than the slow, painstaking grind of human progress. It can feel more thrilling to imagine a spaceship on the Giza Plateau than to appreciate the decades of labor by thousands of skilled workers. Furthermore, the theory taps into a growing distrust of authority and mainstream academia. Positioning oneself as a rebel uncovering a hidden truth is always more appealing than accepting the consensus of experts who have dedicated their lives to meticulous, if sometimes less glamorous, research. This distrust allows the myth to thrive in the fertile ground of the internet, where a compelling video can often outweigh 1,000 peer-reviewed papers. But in embracing this fantasy, we lose something precious. We trade the true, awe-inspiring story of human potential for a cheap science fiction plot. The real wonder of the pyramids is not that aliens might have built them, but that humans did. It is the story of a society that could coordinate a workforce of thousands, feed them, house them, and motivate them to participate in a project that would outlast their civilization by millennia. It is a testament to the power of shared belief, collective effort, and the relentless drive to create something lasting and meaningful. To attribute these wonders to aliens is to diminish ourselves, to sell short the breathtaking creativity, resilience, and intelligence that are the true hallmarks of our species. These stones do not whisper of visitors from another star. They stand as a silent, powerful chorus to what human beings can achieve when we set our minds to a common goal. They are the ultimate answer to the lie, not a mystery to be solved by looking up, but a miracle to be understood by looking back at our own incredible human story. We've journeyed through 24 astonishing cases where fiction was polished into fact, watching as ancient lies slowly solidified into modern truths. From the flat earth myth that never was to the exaggerated grime of medieval life, each story reveals the powerful forces that shape our understanding of the past, cultural bias, political agendas, and our own deep-seated need for compelling narratives. But this exploration is about far more than just correcting a list of errors. It's an invitation to adopt a new lens through which to view the world. History, we've seen, is not a static set of facts carved in stone, but a living, breathing dialogue. It's a continuous conversation between the past and the present, one that is constantly being revised, reinterpreted, and rewritten with each generation. Every era looks backward and sees not necessarily what was, but what it needs to see, often crafting a version of history that justifies its own values, soothes its own anxieties, or reinforces its own power structures. Recognizing this fluid nature is the first step toward true critical engagement. It empowers us to become more active participants in that dialogue, to stop being passive consumers of received wisdom and start asking the crucial questions: who benefits from this story? What evidence supports it, and what complexities might be getting smoothed over to create a simpler, more satisfying tale? This mindset shifts history from a dry subject in a textbook to a thrilling detective story, where we are all invited to examine the clues and challenge the accepted verdict. The real treasure uncovered in this journey isn't just a set of corrected facts. It's a powerful toolkit for skepticism. It equips us to look beyond the surface of any claim, whether it's about a distant emperor or a current event, and to seek out the evidence, to understand the context, and to appreciate the nuance that is so often the first casualty of a good story. So as we reach the end of this particular investigation, let the curiosity it sparked continue to burn. Look around at the world you know and ask yourself what other truths might be built on similarly shaky foundations. What stories do we tell ourselves about our institutions, our technologies, or even our own identities that might be worthy of a second look? The most exciting discoveries are often waiting just on the other side of a question we've been told not to ask. We would love to hear which of these 24 revelations surprised you the most, or what other historical myths you think deserve a closer examination. Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the shadows of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you can join us for the next journey into the mysteries of our past. The search for truth is a continuous adventure, and we've only just